Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. We've got a really fascinating journey ahead of us today. We're going to look at how the modern British novel, well, it definitely wasn't born in some quiet, dusty library. No way. It was this visceral, living reaction to the massive cultural shockwaves that hit between 1945 and the 1990s. Quick look at our roadmap. We'll start with the bleak 50s, move into the 60s cultural revolution, hit postmodernism, explore diverse voices, and finally do a deep dive into the Golden Notebook. All of this is really just to answer one central question. How do you write a story in a world that, honestly, just no longer makes sense? All right, part one, the bleak 50s, a metaphor for broken lives. Let's get into it. So picture the immediate aftermath of 1945. Britain is left in this state of total physical and spiritual ruin. Towns literally torn apart by bombs. And that destruction perfectly mirrored a very real, very deep national depression. The initial relief of peace? Yeah, that was immediately overshadowed by the looming terror of the Cold War, endless economic austerity, and the really painful realization that the British Empire was rapidly falling apart. The whole world was fractured. Writers desperately needed new ways to express that grim confusion. And they found totally different ways to cope. Take Lawrence Durrell, for example. He decided to just play with time. He leaned hard into this modernist distortion where narratives kind of spin on their own axis instead of moving neatly from A to B. But then on the flip side, you've got William Golding. He looked completely inward, offering these incredibly dark anthropological insights into the absolute savagery of human nature. Actually, let's talk about Golding for a second. His 1954 masterpiece, Lord of the Flies, asks a genuinely terrifying question. What happens when society's rules just vanish? It was basically a systematic undoing of all that old Victorian optimism. By stripping his characters of their civilizing constraints, he proves his deeply pessimistic view that barbarity is our default state. I mean, when the character Piggy dies, it's not just a sad plot point, it's the literal death of intellect and order. But hey, other writers found different ways to deal with the gloom. Muriel Spark wove these profound religious themes into incredibly tight economical prose all about self-deception. Conversely, you had Kingsley Amis. He was one of the so-called angry young men who, let's be honest, were actually just quite grumpy. He provided some much-needed comic relief by mercilessly roasting academic pretensions and social snobbery in works like Lucky Jim. Moving right along to part two, the 60s Cultural Revolution, the New Morality Era. So this brings us to a massive pendulum swing. The post-war disenchantment of the 50s inevitably boiled over, giving way to a loud, deliberate cultural rebellion in the 60s. And that rebellion? It basically set the stage for the wild experimentation of the 70s. It was an absolute wholesale rejection of traditional, rigid conventions. And the catalysts for this new era hit like rapid fire. First, the not guilty verdict in the Lady Chatterley's Lover obscenity trial completely blew the doors off publishing censorship. Then, add in the global pop music boom, the Beatles, the Stones, Mary Quant's fashion innovations, the introduction of the birth control pill, and a massive influx of new universities. Boom. Suddenly, society is just vibrating with unprecedented social freedom. Naturally, writers like John Fowles and Margaret Drabble became the official chroniclers of this new vibe. Fowles used sexual liberation as a huge metaphor for tossing out the old rulebook and defying authority. Meanwhile, Drabble focused really intensely on the modern liberated woman. She explored that intense friction between a woman's new professional dreams and those old, lingering societal traps. Okay, on to part three, postmodernism and social change, the era of eclectic experimentation. But like we said, history is a pendulum, right? That 60s optimism absolutely collapsed under 70s economic recessions, oil crises, and the rise of Thatcherism. So the novel had to reinvent itself yet again, this time through postmodernism. Now, this was a deeply cynical reaction to a fractured society. Writers started throwing out traditional story arcs entirely. They embraced playful pastiche and aleatory non, which basically just means totally random combinations. It was this bold new aesthetic that absolutely favored surface over depth. Amidst all this wild experimentation, a brilliant literary tool called magic realism emerged. Taking cues from global heavyweights like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, British authors started seamlessly dropping the extraordinary, we're talking levitation, telepathy, you name it, into stories that otherwise sounded completely normal and everyday. It really was an era of total dualities. On one hand, you had Martin Amis championing this highly complex metafiction, like literally writing himself into his own books. But then, right next to him on the bookstore shelves, you had these gigantic blockbusters like Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy. Those huge novels proved beyond a doubt that readers still had an enormous appetite for good old-fashioned chronological realism. Which brings us to part 4, post-colonial and diverse voices, redefining British identity. As the absolute final remnants of the British Empire dismantled, a really vital shift occurred. A massive influx of diverse perspectives from former colonies permanently enriched the literary landscape. We're talking Salman Rushdie using magic realism for vast historical allegories, Kazuo Ishiguro dissecting emotional paralysis and English duty through these exquisite, completely unreliable narrators, Jeanette Winterson boldly exploring gender and sexual identity, and Angela Carter, she was completely hijacking classic fairy tales and injecting them with dark, subversive sensuality. And finally, part 5, The Golden Notebook, Deconstructing the Contemporary World. This brings us to our climax, really, a novel that perfectly encapsulates this entire historical journey we've been on, Doris Lessing's undisputed 1962 masterpiece, The Golden Notebook. Lessing fundamentally argued that the modern world was simply too overwhelming, too chaotic, for a straight-line story to capture. Her solution? Create a highly complex, deliberately fragmented narrative structure to accurately reflect a completely splintered 20th century reality. So her protagonist, Anna Wolf, tries to make sense of her deeply fractured identity by literally compartmentalizing her life into 4 distinct, color-coded notebooks. It's fascinating. You've got black for her writing life, red for her politics and Communist Party connections, yellow for her literary drafts, and blue for her strictly personal diary. Through this incredible setup, the novel powerfully argues that women are frequently forced into stereotyped roles by patriarchal language, something Lessing actually calls the naming of women. Anna's ultimate quest for wholeness, her attempt to merge all these fragments into a single golden notebook, well, it perfectly mirrors an entire era's desperate search for unity amidst total chaos. Okay, let's pull back and look at the roadmap we just traveled. From the ashes of the bleak 50s, through the liberating 60s, the fragmented postmodern era, and the rise of diverse voices, all culminating in Lessing's structural genius. If there's one thing to take away, it's that the contemporary novel is this incredibly resilient, adaptable medium. It absolutely refuses to sit still in a chaotic world. I'll leave you with this final thought, and it's a big one. If literature is essentially the tool we use to cope with cultural earthquakes, how will today's chaotic, rapidly changing world shape the fiction of tomorrow? Think about it. Keep reading and keep questioning.